I don't like to tell people, oh, you naughty boy or girl, you should not be addicted to the machine. I'm addicted to the machine.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Institute of Art and Ideas live event. My name is Eshe Nelson. I'm an economics and business reporter for the New York Times based in London. Thank you for joining me now for an interview with Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek economist and politician, on why he believes capitalism has ended, what's replaced it, and why central banks are partially the culprit. Yanis, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I really appreciate that.
Great pleasure.
You're in Athens, right? So a couple hours behind us. So thank you. We're here to talk about central banks, and I also want to get to the current inflation situation. But I'd like to take a step back first, because you link central banks in a really interesting way to the big point you make in your latest book, Technofeudalism, What Killed Capitalism. Can you just tell us, what is technofeudalism?
It sounds absurd to hear somebody like me saying that capitalism is finished, because wherever you look, what you see is the triumph of capital over labor, over politics, a wholesale capitalist triumph. And yet here I am saying that capitalism is already gone. So to be specific here, what do I mean by capitalism? What do we mean by capitalism? It's not markets. The idea that capitalism is a system of markets is very, very weak, and it doesn't really capture what capitalism was supposed to be about. Capitalism was supposed to be the economic system that followed from the great transformation of feudalism, that shifted power from the owners of land to the owners of machinery, of capital, of produced means of production, and also channeled all economic activity through markets. That's where markets come in. So labor markets, real estate markets, which didn't exist under feudalism. So profit takes over from ground rent, and markets engulf the whole of economic activity. That, in my view, is already on the way out, if not dead and buried already. Since 2008, we had two major events, outcomes, flowing out of the disaster, the financial sector disaster in 2008. The first one you already mentioned. What did the great and the good do after the great crash of 2008? They got together under, if you remember, the auspices of Gordon Brown in London in April 2009, and the G7 and the G20 decided to coordinate money printing, central bank money printing capacity. They printed around $35 trillion.
What we would call quantitative easing these days.
Quantitative easing, yes, that's a nice polite term. They printed huge quantities of money, I mean, torrents of cash, which they gave to the financial sector to deflate it. And at the same time, every single one of them, whether they admitted to it or not, doesn't matter, practiced quite harsh austerity, fiscal austerity. So you have this amazing combination. On the one hand, you have the greatest liquidity in the financial circuits of financial capital in the history of capitalism, huge liquidity, and at the same time, very low levels of demand for investment. Because when you practice austerity, aggregate demand crashes. Even if you give money to big business, they're not going to invest, because they look at the masses, and they say, well, they can't afford to buy expensive products from us, so we're not going to invest. So they take the available liquidity, and usually what they mostly did with it was to pump it back into the financial sector to buy back their own shares, for instance. And therefore you had asset price inflation and price deflation at the same time. The only serious investment that took place between 2009 and today, and 2023, let's say, was in what I call cloud capital, in big tech, algorithmic machinery from optic fibers, server farms, and so on, the Silicon Valley stuff. But not only Silicon Valley, but also the equivalent in China, because you have these two big techs. You have an American big tech and a Chinese big tech. And why is this relevant to what I was saying before about capitalism and being replaced or killed off? Well, if my hypothesis is right in my book, that profits have been replaced, on the one hand, by state money, the quantitative easing that you mentioned, and by the massive rents retained by big tech. So every time you buy something of Amazon.com, anything between 20 and 40% of the price is skimmed off by Jeff Bezos from the capitalist who actually sells whatever it is that you're buying, electric bicycle, exercise bike, binoculars, books, whatever. Everything you sell is charged a huge amount of what is equivalent to ground rent in feudal terms. I call it cloud rent, because it is the money that vassal capitalists have to pay to big tech to gain access to you. And add to this the remarkable reinforcement mechanism, machine learning, AI-driven algorithms, which, take Alexa or Siri or any of these interfaces. What these things do, I mean, they are pieces of capital, right? But they are not capital like steam engines or indeed industrial robots, because they're not produced means of production. They are produced means of behavioral modification that has never existed before in the history of capitalism. So we train Alexa to train us, to train it, to train us, to know us well enough, to give us fantastic advice which I personally follow, because when it recommends a book, I usually want to read it, okay? And then not only does it actually do the job of the advertiser, of Don Draper in Mad Men, if you've ever watched that great series, right? But it also, so it's an automated capital version of Don Draper. But unlike Don Draper and all the great advertisers, such and such and so on, who were very good at implanting in your head ideas of what you wanted to buy, such and Don Draper could not sell it to you. You had to go to the shops to get it. Well, now the same algorithm sells it to you. It arrives on your doorstep, bypassing markets, because Amazon.com is not a market.
So you're kind of describing, we had the 2008 crisis, huge amounts of money flood into the system and heading into the direction of particularly large tech companies in both the US and China. And so now it's an economic system that, as you say, isn't being driven by profits, but is instead being driven by rent. But just take that one step further. It sounds bad, but just explain why it's bad for me or, the person, my neighbor, like why that change in system, which we may not really perceive has happened, is actually bad for us.
Look, I'm not making a moral case. I'm not moralizing. I'm not saying this is bad because, Jeff Bezos is getting rich and people. No, what I'm saying is this. The economy that we live in, when a large amount of profit turns into rent or is skimmed off by rentiers, that economic energy, think of it as economic energy, is taken out of the circular flow of income. Because when Jeff Bezos gains another 10 billion through the practices of Amazon.com, he has absolutely no reason to invest it into the economy that your neighbors are participating in. Let me give you a very simple numerical example. Take General Motors or Volkswagen or British Aerospace, one of the traditional capitalist firms. They more or less, it's interesting that more or less spend about the same proportion of their revenues on wages. It's about 85%. All the large corporations, traditional corporations, capitalist corporations, of every 100 pounds that they extract from the market, they pay 85 in wages. And that money, that 85 pounds, circulates in the economy. Do you know what the percentage is that Mr. Zuckerberg pays his employees in Meta? Less than 1% goes to workers. So that money, again, this is not a moral point I'm making. It's a factual point. It's a point that this money is extracted from the circular flow of income. And that issue, what that does is it forces central banks to keep printing, even today, through various ways, in order to replenish the lost economic activity, energy. So even though now we've moved from deflation to inflation, a serious cost of living crisis, central banks, even though they want to diminish the amount of money printing they do, they are stopped from doing that, because the more cloud rent is extracted from the economy due to this transition from from capitalism to what I call technocapitalism, technofeudalism, right? This essentially makes the job of central bankers impossible. Governments are fiscally stressed So there is nothing they can do about it. And in the meantime, you have the depreciation of the quality of jobs that people do, with the shift of employment to a kind of techno-feudal environment. Think of people working for Uber, for Deliveroo, for Amazon's warehouses, precariously employed labor, which cannot make plans for future expenditure on houses, on durables. So the whole system becomes much more prone to crisis. And that is something that your neighbor should care about.
Yeah, I want to absolutely come back to this point about the impact it has on today's current inflation crisis. But one other just kind of big, broader question is, does this system only work if we are somewhat beholden to kind of these devices, whether it's Alexa, Siri, and these companies? I mean, we tend to use them for what feels like quite trivial things these days. You describe them as us training them and they train us, but it's when you look at what people ask these things, it's like, what is the weather? What's your recipe for this thing? What's the sports score? In what ways do you feel like we are or aren't actually beholden to these these devices, these companies, the ability to actually move away from them should we choose? Is it that because you have this kind of idea of a new serfdom in your book?
Look, I'm not prone to, again, as I said, moralizing. I don't like to tell people, oh, you naughty boy or girl, you should not be addicted to the machine. I'm addicted to the machine. These machines are extremely useful. I find them, in my research, in my studying, in my enjoyment of life, listening to music. Spotify is a great source of joy for me. Suddenly I can listen to any song that I remember from my childhood. And suddenly I can listen to it. I'm never going to turn against the users of these apps and these platforms. But I need to focus on the fact that these algorithms, which could be perfectly useful and perfectly benign, because they are owned by very, very few people whose job is to maximize cloud rent extraction, these algorithms are written in order to be addictive. And to be addictive in a way which is quite pernicious for the psyche of our people, and especially younger people. So I don't blame people for using them. I'm not a Luddite. I do not believe, even though I shouldn't say that because Luddites were very misunderstood and they were quite wonderful activists in their time, and they've been given a very bad press. But you know what I mean? I'm not anti-technology. I'm not saying that we should go back to the cave. There's no doubt that if you want to escape techno-feudalism, you get rid of your smartphone, you get an old Nokia, you use cash all the time, you never go online. But that is not the solution. It is like saying, imagine if this was the 1770s when Adam Smith was writing his tome about the wealth of nations and the transition of feudalism to capitalism. Imagine if we were saying, okay, well, this is not a very good development, so let's abandon machinery and let's go back to hammers and sickles.
No, I do find this link between the low interest rate environment that we were in up until about a year ago to the rise of these companies to be very, very interesting. And it reminded me of what was just like a flood of money quite recently towards these 10-minute grocery apps. I don't know if you saw, there was just as recently as last summer, this idea that actually there is a lot of money in the system, and where is it actually going if many people are experiencing some form of austerity. And so I asked, a few central bankers, as I want to do, what they thought of this link. And some said actually they felt like there was more it was more of a coincidental link between the rise of these tech companies and low interest rates. But one did say something that I just wanted to read you a little bit from. So one of the central bankers I spoke to said, I do think there's an interesting point about technology having evolved towards intangible capital becoming more important in such a way as to create low marginal cost technologies that have created a winner takes it all environment like never before, a rise in market power and a rise in the concentration of wealth. That's possibly led to lower productivity growth too, but feels that low interest rates are more likely a result of this low productivity growth, as well as demographics, rather than the cause of it. And I want to ask you how much you prescribe, central bank policy as some of the some of the causes of these conditions as versus politics and regulation of these companies?
Oh, that's a great question. Look, I'm not hypothesizing, I'm not proposing that central banks were willfully boosting big tech capital. For goodness sake, no. What happened was in 2008, 2009, central banks panicked. They were in a state of absolute panic. And because governments, treasuries, were effectively hamstrung, central bankers had the unenviable task of being the only game in town. So they started printing like mad, and given their charters, they couldn't give it to good causes. They couldn't give it to people to actually invest directly. I mean, this was the failure of our parliaments. Our parliament should have legislated. So, for instance, as to create, a public investment bank in Britain, whose bonds then the Bank of England could buy, could channel the central bank money, printed money, directly into green investments. But Parliament didn't do that. So the Bank of England could do the only thing that they could do, given their charter and given the law, which is to simply buy whatever debt they could get their hands on. And effectively that transferred huge quantities of money to the financiers, who then had a very big problem. Who was going to take the money off their hands? They were not going to give it to the little people, because the little people were being squeezed by austerity. So the bankers who had already lost a lot of money in 2008, as if they were going to give it to little people who would default on them. So they gave it to the big companies. The big companies would not invest because the little people would not buy. So what they did was they went back to the stock exchange and they bought shares, and you had the everything rally for years. And the low interest rates were not the result of policy. They were the result of this incongruity. Huge liquidity. What's liquidity? It's the supply of money. And very low investment, which is the demand for money. So when supply constantly exceeds demand, the price of this thing keeps falling. What is the price of this thing? It's the interest rate. So, they were totally at a loss to do anything else, the central bankers. So I'm not moralizing. I'm saying that they did whatever they could, given the constraints that they had to function in. It was at that time that surreptitiously, nobody had planned it. There was no design here, no conspiracy whatsoever. The only people who actually took the money and invested it in real capital, in actual capital, were big tech. And they created cloud capital. And okay, so that's step number one, right? Once that happened, after 2017, 2018, that is where the feedback loop starts, because the huge power, market power of these companies, the fact that it wasn't even market power, it was the capacity to replace markets. As I say, when I say that when you enter Amazon.com, you exit markets, the immense power to extract rents from the economy then made the central bankers' job even harder. And that creates that loop, that feedback, negative feedback effect, the doom loop, which I think is what your central banker friend or acquaintance has been saying in slightly more central banking language.
Central bankers are known for their
which I try to avoid,
Yes.
I can speak it, but I don't like it.
As we were all right to not get too caught up in central bank speech. But let's bring that to today's crisis, because you mentioned near at the start there that one of the things that could be a consequence of this is that central bankers haven't been able to combat the current rise in inflation maybe as forcefully as they otherwise would. Was that the point you were making?
It's one of the points I'm making. You have this two-way process. On the one hand, central banks that have caused an inflationary bout in conjunction with a supply chain disruption due to the pandemic are trying to wind this down. They are trying to arrest inflation at a time when the increasing predominance, the increasing power of what I call cloud capital and its capacity to extract rents from the economy calls upon the central bankers not to do that which they want to do in order to address inflation. So that is the conundrum, as I see it.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, we can't turn back time. So we can't go back and undo, the past decade and a half, nor necessarily would central bankers have responded differently. But going forward, I mean, what do you think could be done differently? I mean, you're not just a man of ideas, you're also a man of political action. What would you like to see the shape of policy be like? How do you, now you've alerted us to a situation to avoid its escalation or to kind of take a handle on the current crisis? What would you maybe like to see?
Well, a number of things. Firstly, I think it was a very big mistake of central bankers to assume, and that was an assumption, I don't think they actually thought too much about it, that quantitative easing should simply be turned into quantitative tightening in reverse. What do I mean by that? Remember, after 2009, they started reducing interest rates, reducing until they hit the zero low bound. When that didn't work, they started printing money. So they assume that quantitative tightening must be the opposite. First, they stop printing, and then they increase interest rates. Look at the European Central Bank. Okay.
Yes, but to various extents, because obviously only the Bank of England is the one selling assets, right? Lots of other central banks are still kind of reinvesting much of.
But still, they stopped printing. They stopped printing. Both the ECB and the Fed stopped printing. First stopped printing. They wound down their printing slowly, month by month, and then they started increasing the interest rates. What I had recommended was that they increase interest rates very quickly, not by 25 basic points or 50 basic. Take them up immediately from 0 point something to 3.5% in a month. But at the same time, don't stop printing. But what do I mean by printing? Print more money to channel into productive capital. In conjunction with what I mentioned before, you remember I said, for instance, the European Union has the European Investment Bank. Mm-hmm. So my recommendation to the European Union was increase interest rates immediately from minus 0.7% to 3.5% to arrest inflation, while continuing to print the same quantities of money every month, but don't buy Greek bonds or Italian bonds or Coca-Cola bonds, but buy EIB bonds and have a $500 billion per year green transition investment program in order to ensure that you do not fall into a recession, especially in the things that we need to invest in, like, green energy. Mm-hmm. And I was saying that before Putin invaded Ukraine. So that's one thing. I think that central banks should pluck the money tree, but in conjunction with investment banks, green investment banks. I would prefer them to be public, because private investment banks don't really exist that actually invest in things that humanity needs. And pay, we have COP28 now. Yes. This is a major cop-out. And you can see that no one is seriously thinking about where the money is going to come from. We have fiscally stressed governments. It's all greenwashing. But if we had that, okay, that's one thing I would like to see. The second thing I would like to see is a serious digital tax. A cloud tax. I would put it very simply. There's no way of taxing Amazon properly. Whatever the OECD has done is simply not bothering Jeff Bezos at all. He continues to pay exactly zero because he's got the best accountants in the world, and he can always buy and sell IP licenses for whatever amount of money is necessary to report zero profits in Ireland. This is why we need to impose serious cloud taxes and make sure that money is what replenishes aggregate demand in our countries. So these are just a couple of ideas of how to maintain aggregate demand, divert it into investment into the things society needs, especially in view of the climate catastrophe that we're facing. Okay? And at the same time, have interest rates going up in order to slowly deflate the asset bubbles that quantitative easing created in conjunction with the pandemic.
Thank you, Yanis, for joining us. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you.